Bonjour, soyez bienvenue à cette vidéo sur France Exposition 2019. Hello, my name is Isabelle Blight. I'm a student at the Hague University and I study European Studies. In this video, I will talk about France in a spectrum of tourism in France, and I will talk about three different dimensions of tourism. First one, I'm going to speak about economy regarding tourism in France. Then I will speak about the culture involving tourism in France. And lastly, I will talk about politics involving tourism in France as well. So let's begin. Shall we talk about numbers? My first dimension will be about economy revolving tourism. Well, France is one of the most visited countries in the world, ranking as a leading destination for international tourists. Giving an example, in 2016, France received roughly 200 million people this year. Paris is the most visited city in France, and it's one of the most visited cities in Europe, and actually is the third most visited city in the world. In 2016, for another example, only in Paris, tourist spendings were roughly around $30 billion US. So that was only in Paris. You can imagine what was the tourist spendings in the whole country. That's how tourism in France moves the economy of the country. To be more exact, the data that they got in 2016 regarding the economy linked to tourism in France was that travel and tourism contributed a total of almost 200 billion euros in the country and to France's GDP, and GDP is gross domestic product. And also tourism employment created around 3 billion jobs. And these jobs can be working at hotels, working as tourist guides, and any kind of jobs that you deal with tourists and you help them. And this helps the economy of the country because you create more jobs, thus you have more people working, and this is how tourism can be also linked to the economy of France. Since it's one of the most visited countries in the world, you can know that there's a lot of money being involved in those activities. So how can I define travel and tourism contribution to the economy in France? I have some examples. There are some direct ways of contribution and indirect ways. The direct spendings can be related to visitors, exports, such as international visitors that come in the country by business or just for leisure and spend their money in the country. However, direct spendings can also be related to internal consumptions. So domestic travel, domestic tourism, so people that already live in France, visiting different cities, buying products. So this also is a direct spending that is linked to tourism. The other category is indirect contribution, which is related to the government spendings in travel and tourism in the country to support general tourism. So in transportation, in buildings, in ways to make it easier for tourists, and also capital investments by different industries that are related to travel and tourism. So this is the indirect ways of investing in tourism, comparing to the direct ways, which is people buying products. To give an idea of how much things cost in France, let's compare the Netherlands and France. The cost of living in France is 0.31% higher than the Netherlands. So it's basically the same. So if, for example, a tourist in the Netherlands wants to go to France, they can expect a little bit higher prices, but overall nothing will change. Summing up this first dimension of tourism in France, tourism is so successful in France, it's even too successful because there are too many tourists coming to the country that a lot of sightseeings and common places that people want to visit are full and overcrowded. So the head of tourism in France are urging for people to make bookings and try to make reservation before to go to very, very famous places, very famous museums, because there's just too many people trying to visit France. Although it's very good for the economy, it can be very bad for people that live there. So this is it for the first dimension, economy, regarding tourism in France. Now let's move on to the cultural dimension. In the second part of this video, we're going to talk about culture. Paris and France in general is kind of self-advertising itself due to people romanticizing the country and the city of Paris, and also due to the history regarding the Victorian era. So here are the top 5 most visited cities in France. First, Paris, of course, then Bordeaux, then Marseille, Toulouse, Lyon, Montpellier. These were actually 6 cities, but Paris is known to be the first one, so I just gave you 5 more. Now I will talk about the most visited tourist attractions in France. Most of them are in Paris because this is the most visited city after all. So first, museums. Musée du Louvre, which is the most famous one and the biggest. It takes a lot of time to see everything inside. Then, Musée d'Orsay, which also is really famous and is also in Paris. Next, we have the famous Eiffel Tower, which everyone knows, and it's one of the main attractions. Then Arc de Triomphe, Notre Dame, and Palace de Versailles. So these were some practical things and tips to go if you want to visit France and that most people visit. Now I'm going to talk about regions, touristic regions in France. After the Parisian region, the most leading region to visit in France is called French Riviera, or also known as Côte d'Azur. It's also there where every year you have the Cannes Film Festival, which probably most of you know about. So yeah, this is one of the most famous destinations to go after Paris. Then we have Provence, which is also where Marseille is, which is one of the 5 cities that I told you about. This is considered to be a capital of culture because actually there's a lot of natural sites there, such as Georges du Verdon, Calanque National Park, and a typical landscape of Luberon. That's what it's called, the landscapes that you can find in Provence. It's a really famous region to go to as France, and it's really beautiful. Another region, the third one, is called Loire Valley. In French, La Vallée des Loire. So this is a very famous one due to their castles, because after the French revolutions, many castles were destroyed and you don't have a trace of them. But in this valley, in this region, you can find many of them. So they have a lot of history and it's a really interesting place. And the last region that I'm going to talk about is the French Alps. So this is a region that is very famous in the winter because it's there that you can go to ski. There's a lot of resorts and it's a really nice place to go with families. Another place that I'm going to be talking about is Alsace-Lorraine. It's not considered to be a region, but this is really famous due to the conflict between Germany and France. That's why you may know about it. But in France, the Alsace-Lorraine is really famous due to their really good, sweet and refreshing wines. And they mostly are known for their white wines, but they also sell red wines there. But this is why they're very famous in France. Now, let's talk about my favorite part of culture in France, which is food. France is really known for its cuisine, and I'm going to say a little bit of their traditional dishes or things that people eat there. So, first of all, crêpe. Crêpe is the thing that every French person eats. Kids, teenagers, adults, old people, everyone eat them, and it's really famous between tourists as well. In the streets, usually you can find some little cars that sell crepes directly, and the most common flavor, I would say, is definitely Nutella and crepes. It's really easy to make, and everyone can do it, and everyone loves it. Then we also have, of course, baguette, which is the traditional bread. It's kind of the symbol of France. People eat that all the time. Another thing that's really specific of France, and they eat it with the bread, is rillette, which is kind of a pâté, but it's typically French. Then, as full dishes, we can say cassoulet, which is white beans that they mix with pork, and they let it simmer, let it cook for long hours, and it's really rich in flavor. Of course, there's also the famous dish ratatouille, which is famous due to the movie with the little rat. Ratatouille is basically a bouillon of tomato sauce and a lot of different vegetables, which is typically tomato, then aubergine and courgette. Lastly, but probably the most important food that French consume is cheese. So one of the most famous cheeses are Brie, Camembert, but there's also Beaufort, Roquefort, Gruyere, and the list goes on and on. Now, talking about beverages in France, of course, the thing that pops into your mind is wine. And yes, this is also a drink that's very common there because in very different regions and also in the city of Alsace-Lorraine, which I told about before, wine is produced kind of everywhere in the country. Also, Champagne in the city of Champagne is also coming from France. But in terms of normal drinks that people usually drink there is hot cocoa, also orangina, which is a fizzy drink of orange, and also grenadine, which is a syrup of a really sweet syrup that you mix with water. And this is what usually people drink there, apart from wine, which is the most common one. To finish up the part of culture regarding tourism in France, a really big thing in the country is visual arts. So ballet was born in France, and this is why many people go to France to try and see ballet concerts. Also, opera is really famous in the country. It's also due to, at the beginning of the history of opera, it linked to religious intentions of art, and then it popularized itself with the elite and became a really famous thing that people really enjoy going to. And another big thing regarding culture is, of course, fashion. France is a country known for its fashion models, also its brands like Chanel, and this is also a reason that many people choose to go to France. So now we're on the last dimension of tourism in France. The last one is about politics. So everything regarding laws, maybe that are linked to tourism directly or indirectly, what is forbidden, what is allowed, or maybe something that the government chose to do to make tourism better or more protected, or some things related to that. So, first of all, we study in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, some drugs such as weed are legal. But in France, that's not the case. No drugs are legal in France. You cannot take anything. Also, alcohol is forbidden to consume in the streets, and also it's prohibited to smoke inside and also in the outside parts of restaurants. Due to past circumstances of terrorist attacks, safety is a major concern in the country. In 2017, the French president declared state of emergency, and what happened after that is that basically safety increased all over the country, and most importantly in the most famous cities such as Paris, for example. So this involves having extra checks. People in hotels, in restaurants are allowed to check your bag if they want to. In events, now they always put more security, more police to make sure that nothing's going to happen. In airports, also the security has increased, and this is to make the country feel safe and to prevent any other circumstance like that to happen ever again. This has a direct effect in tourism because if France was a country that wasn't considered to be safe, people just wouldn't go there to visit, and that wouldn't help the country in an economic way. But they are doing everything they can to make the country safe because it is safe. These are just some isolated events that happened, and this is what they did to try to make everything feel secure. Another aspect that we can see politics involving tourism in France is about their public policies regarding mobility. As you all know, a lot of tourists go to France, within inside the country or outside the country, to visit the cities, and it's a huge issue if the cities are not good enough and do not promote mobility for people to visit everything. So what is being made in terms of mobility to make big cities such as Paris make it easier for people to visit and for the people who live there? They are trying to decrease the amount of cars in the streets in the big centers, so you have days that you cannot use the cars in some lanes. Another thing that they are doing is making an incentive to use public transportation, of course, and this is being made by implementing a technological system and an easier system that make people, such as foreigners, understand easier how it works, to encourage them to use it and not rent cars, for example. Another thing that they are trying to do is that they're making it compulsory so that every sightseeing and especially every public transportation to be accessible for people with disabilities, so they can also participate in these sections of tourism in the country and make it easier for them as well. There is also a political movement that has been going on recently in France that needs to be mentioned because it affects both the economy and tourism in France. The movement is Le Mouvement des Gilets Jaunes, which is the Yellow Vest movement. They are basically asking for a minimum wage increase. What they want with this movement is for the president to lower the fuel prices. Also, they are saying that the cost of living in France is too high, and for that they want a minimum wage increase, and they are also requesting a tax reform. What has been going on that is affecting tourism and economy is that there is a lot of number of flights that has decreased to Paris, and to be exact, the flight decreased almost 10% since the movement began in November of 2018. Another effect that it has on the economy, since it's been the 10th week of this protest in France, is that reservations and bookings also have decreased in Paris and the whole country due to the protests. And the decrease was by almost 7% in all bookings in hotels and restaurants and sightseeings that tourists usually do. And another thing that has been affected is that many stores in the famous street Champs-Élysées, which is known by the tourists and it's where they do their shoppings, have actually closed down due to protesters and lack of safety and aggressivity. So this is also a thing that is political due to it being French citizens requesting things from the government, but this is affecting the tourism and it's affecting the economy, so this also should be mentioned. Another important aspect that needs to be mentioned here is since the refugee crisis that has been happening all over Europe, this also affected tourism in France. In which way? Well, since it is a really important issue that many refugees don't have places to live, don't have food, and cannot have the living conditions that they deserve, there is also a thing that's been really helpful, and also it's been growing in France, which is called solidarity tourism. In this term, it means that people from other countries, or even within France, they go to certain places that people need help, and they give as much help they can, and try making refugees' life better and help them engage in society. So to sum this video up, I have talked about France and about the main topic that is tourism in France, but I did mention 3 different dimensions, which were, first of all, the economic dimension of tourism, and I said that Paris is the main city of France, and it's where most of income regarding tourists, international tourists, come and help the GDP of the country. I have then talked about culture, specifically about food, about museums that they have there, about the specific regions. And then I talked about politics with some little laws that are linked to tourism, and also what has been done with security since attacks. And also I talked a little bit about refugees and what that affect and how this affected the country regarding tourism, because it's also linked together. So I really hope you enjoyed this video and that you could learn something more about France, and maybe you want to visit it now or you want to visit it more. Thank you!